officer and several authors of books on the assassination. They discussed returning the film to the family of Abraham Zapruder, a one-time Dallas resident who filmed the assassination, or if it should stay in the hands of the government. This 2-hour and 15-minute hearing took place at the National Archives, where the Zapruder film is stored.
I'll call to order this public hearing of the Assassination Records Review Board. Thank you all for coming today. I want to first express my appreciation, the appreciation of the board, to the National Archives for permitting us to meet in this historic reception room. And we're happy to be here and happy to be able to use the facilities. This is not a meeting or a function of the National Archives. The Assassination Records Review Board is an independent federal agency, not part of the National Archives. I would ask that everyone take care with the antiques and old furniture and rugs that are in this building or in this room. We'd appreciate that. I also want to thank our witnesses today for agreeing to participate in this important hearing for the board. A little information about the board. The Assassination Records Review Board, the members were appointed by President Clinton, confirmed by the Senate in 1994. We have been at work now for almost 3 years working on implementing the President John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act of 1992. We primarily have been locating, securing, and releasing to the public records related to the tragic assassination of President Kennedy. Much of the records that have been released are records that have been held in federal government files. We also have been on the search for additional records, whether they be in the hands of state and local governments or in the hands of private individuals who may wish to donate their material to the United States. This has resulted in a ever-growing collection of records of the assassination at the National Archives at College Park. Upwards of nearly 3.5 million pages are now available to the public at the National Archives. The goal of the Assassination Records Review Board was the goal of Congress in passing the Records Collection Act, is to ensure the broadest possible public release of the records of the assassination of President Kennedy, relevant records which were created before the assassination, and certainly all of the records of its investigatory aftermath. It is not, I emphasize, it's not the responsibility of the Review Board to solve remaining mysteries associated with the assassination or to reach conclusions about the assassination itself. Rather, it is the duty of the board and the responsibility of the board to secure and release to the public to the greatest extent possible the records that unfortunately have remained shrouded in secrecy through so many years since the event in 1963. Let me turn to today's hearing. The purpose of today's hearing is to seek public comment and advice on what should be done with the camera original motion picture film of the assassination that was taken by Abraham Zapruder on November 22nd, 1963. That film has been stored, the original has been stored at the National Archives. It was placed there by Mr. Zapruder's heirs, which now have formed a company, and they claim to possess legal title to the film. So the Review Board is faced with the question of how to properly handle this artifact, the camera original film from the day of the assassination. We have assembled today for testimony an interesting group of experts related to legal issues that are associated with this question, and certainly issues relative to the value of the camera original film taken by Abraham Zapruder, the film itself. I'd like to ask before we begin whether any of the other review board members have any comments that they'd like to make before we get into the witnesses. Anyone wish to? Okay. Again, I appreciate all of you coming today. Thank you for attending this hearing. We're going to hear first from the General Counsel for the Assassination Records Review Board, Mr. Jeremy Gunn, who is going to outline some of the issues that are presented to the review board by the Zapruder film. Mr. Gunn?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the review board, Dr. Marwell. The meetings of this board are regulated by the federal law called the Government in the Sunshine Act. Under the Sunshine Act, the review board's deliberations should be open to the public, except to the extent that the deliberations would involve issues relating to national security or certain types of legal strategy. The vast majority of the board's deliberations to date have been in closed meetings where issues of national security have been discussed in the records that the board has reviewed. The question now before the board is what action it should take, if any, with regard to the disposition of the original Zapruder film. It necessarily involves discussion of issues that are properly within the public domain, but it also involves issues that may involve some type of legal strategy. In my opinion, the board is acting properly in holding this open meeting and, to the greatest extent possible, deliberating publicly about issues that are of public concern. I'd like to provide a little bit of background about the Zapruder film. The conventional story of the Zapruder film is as follows. Mr. Abraham Zapruder was a clothing manufacturer in Dallas, Texas, who had his company was located near Dealey Plaza. On November 22nd, Mr. Zapruder took his late model Bell & Howell zoom camera containing double 8mm Kodak film to Dealey Plaza to record the presidential motorcade. The film that he took there is now universally regarded as including some of the most important images of the actual assassination. After the motorcade passed, the Secret Service learned of his film and accompanied him to a Kodak laboratory in Dallas where the original film was developed. They then went to Jameson Film Company, which made 3 copies, which I'll refer to as the first day copies of the original film. 2 of those first day copies were loaned to the Secret Service and are now in the hands and in the custody of the National Archives. They are the property of the U.S. government. The third first day film, along with the original, was subsequently sold, as I will get into in a moment. Now, when I refer to the terms original and camera original, I'm describing what is generally thought to have been the film that was actually in Mr. Zapruder's camera at the time the motorcade passed. I will use the term copy to refer to any image that was made from that original film. Some researchers believe that what we are calling here today the camera original may not in fact be the camera original film. I'm going to continue to use the term camera original to describe what is commonly understood without any prejudice to whether in fact that is the original film or not, or whether there may indeed be a copy that, or a film that precedes that. Shortly after the film was developed, Mr. Zapruder sold the original film and his remaining first day copy to Time Inc. Although there has been some controversy in the past regarding the amount that Mr. Zapruder was actually paid by Time Inc., the record reflects that he received a $25,000 cash payment, which he then gave to the Dallas Police Department for the widow of Officer Tippett, and he received subsequent payments of totaling approximately $150,000 over a several-year time span. Life magazine, which then had the original film, published some frames of the Zapruder film as early as November 29th, 1963, and in some subsequent issues during the following 2 years. In 1975, Time Life sold the original film to LMH Company for $1. The shareholders of LMH Company are the widow and the children of Mr. Zapruder, who now is deceased. In 1978, LMH Company placed the original film in the National Archives under a storage agreement. LMH Company believes today that it currently possesses legal title to this film that is now located in the National Archives. Although the public does not now have access to the original film, this would not necessarily change if the U.S. government were to have possession rights over the original film. The Archives keeps the film in cold storage at what I understand to be 25 degrees Fahrenheit in archivally sound conditions. The original film, due to shrinkage, cannot now be shown on a standard motion picture projector. The possible uses of the original today would thus be presumably limited to forensics examinations of the film as well as to making master copies of the film, either internegatives or interpositives of the film. At the Archives today, there are still slide copies of the film that are available for examination. Copies of individual frames as well as the film itself are widely available to the public in books, magazines, in videos, motion pictures, and there's even a version on CD-ROM. One of the questions that the board needs to consider under the JFK Act is whether the Zapruder film is an assassination record within the meaning of the Act. The Review Board's authority, of course, derives from the JFK Act, which was passed by Congress in 1992. The JFK Act itself provides for the, quote, expeditious public transfer of assassination records to the National Archives. So the question is raised, is this Zapruder film an assassination record that should be in the JFK collection at the archive, and essentially should that be federal government property rather than the property of private citizens? To some extent, the statute answers at least part of this question. Under the JFK Act, an assassination record includes, among other records, any, quote, for quote, any record that is related to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy that was made available for use by the Warren Commission. The record reflects that the Zapruder film, the original Zapruder film, was explicitly and specifically requested by the Warren Commission, and the Warren Commission and the staff were shown versions of the original Zapruder film. This would seem to suggest that within the statutory definition, the Zapruder film qualifies as being an assassination record. Moreover, the board, independently from prior statements, believes that the original film is an assassination record within the meaning of its own regulations. Now, at this public hearing today, there are things that I understand the board will be doing and things that they're not be doing. In order that there be some clarity, I'll try and suggest some of the things that I think the board is not going to be doing. The board is not seeking comment from the public regarding whether the Zapruder film is one of the most important records of the assassination. The reason the board would not be considering this is that that is a foregone conclusion that that is the case. The board already acknowledges this. Nor is there a question whether the Zapruder film is an assassination record under the JFK Act, as I have just outlined. Nor does the board question whether, in the ideal world where no costs involved, whether the Zapruder film ought to be possessed by the U.S. government and placed in the archives. The board also is not undertaking today any examination regarding the authenticity of the Zapruder film, although it is aware of the controversies surrounding those allegations. The board also is not holding a hearing on whether LMH Company possesses legal title to the Zapruder film. That would, to the extent that that is a controversy, be a matter for the courts. Similarly, the board is evaluating the validity of LMH Company's copyright interest in the film. That also would be a matter for the courts. Rather, the core question for the board today is whether it should undertake an action that would affect a taking, in constitutional terms, of the original film, or whether the board should seek a negotiated arrangement with the Zapruder family, now LMH Company, that would attempt to, A, make high-quality copies of the Zapruder film easily available to the public for the first time, B, provide for forensic testing of the film to determine in part any questions related to authenticity, and C, would ensure that the U.S. Congress has an option, if it so chooses, to purchase the film. So the choice then for the review board is, to some extent, should the film be taken and transferred to the JFK collection in the archives, or should a negotiated arrangement be made that would include some terms that would make copies of the film easily available to the public. I'd like to outline the parameters of the two options before the board. So the first one is the taking option. The first witness who will be following me, Professor Brownice, will discuss some of the constitutional and statutory issues involving how the federal government takes private property for public use. I am in somewhat of a quandary in that I am the general counsel for the board, and the board is entitled to my confidential legal advice, which I have attempted to provide. And I believe it would be inappropriate for me to express my own opinions on this matter in this particular forum, but Professor Brownice will examine those issues from his perspective. Should the review board believe that a taking is appropriate, it would instruct, presumably, the Archivist of the United States that the Zapruder film should be transferred to the JFK collection at the archives. Now, to one extent, that is a paper transfer. The film would be continued to be stored in exactly the same location, but rather than having the LMH company be recorded as the owner, the U.S. government would be the owner of the film. Although there are several possible developments that might follow from that instruction by the board, one likely scenario is that LMH company would then sue the federal government in the United States Court of Federal Claims and demand just compensation for having been deprived of its property. The Department of Justice would then presumably represent the United States and the review board in any following litigation. If the court were to agree that the review board has the authority to transfer the film, the court would then presumably determine the value of the film and order that LMH company be compensated out of funds from the U.S. Treasury. Under this particular scenario, Congress would not need to make any particularized appropriation of funds for the film, although payments nevertheless are derived from funds appropriated by Congress for this litigation fund. If the board were to attempt a negotiated arrangement option, it would likely follow along the following, likely contain the following provisions. First, LMH would agree to make the best available copy of the Zapruder film using the best available current technology. The high-quality copy would include images that are between the sprocket holes on the original film. A digitized version of this film or of the original film could then be made. Second, LMH would agree to make this high-quality copy available to researchers for their individual use. Thus, to the extent that LMH has a perfected copyright interest in the film, they would agree to license, to some extent, the use of the high-quality images. Although copies would be available at cost to the public from the archives, LMH would nevertheless continue to possess whatever copyright interest it would have in the film. Thus, although members of the public could then easily purchase for the first time high-quality images of the film for their individual use, the license agreement with the archives would not provide that members of the public would be entitled to make subsequent commercial use of that film. So a member of the public could request the film, obtain a copy of it. They could not then, under this arrangement, go out and redistribute that or put it into a movie or put it into a book and make profits on it. Fourth, Congress would be given an option to purchase the film. Such an option could be formulated in different ways. Nevertheless, an agreement would provide that Congress would be given an opportunity to purchase the film, to place that in the archives, or to have the government have permanent possession of it in the archives. Finally, the basic term that would likely be involved in such a negotiated agreement, the government would be able to conduct all appropriate forensics tests of the original film, including any and all tests that would reasonably answer the question of the film's authenticity. I think that there are a few questions the board ought to consider from the experts who have been called here today and from other members of the public who will be speaking, and I'd like to give some suggestions of the sorts of questions that would be appropriate. First, in regard to the camera original film. Does the original Zapruder film possess an intrinsic historical value such that the review board should take action to ensure that the original is kept at the National Archives regardless of costs? Second, what harms might befall the original if the government does not acquire the film? For example, could a private purchaser purchase the film from LH Company, cut the film into individual frames, and then sell that on the public, thus destroying the integrity of the original film. Another question is the original film itself a wasting asset in the sense that it has deteriorated over time and that it will continue to deteriorate over time, so that conceivably a copy of the film right now may be worth more for its evidentiary value than would the original film be 20 years from now. That's a question for the experts. Over time, will a copy, the next question, could a high-quality copy of the film, which includes images between the sprockets, satisfy all of the legitimate needs of researchers and scholars? And if not, which specific needs would not be satisfied by a copy of the original? Another question is, could such needs be addressed by the governments conducting a forensics examination? Could a panel of experts be assembled who could look at the original film and make determinations regarding either the speed at which the film went, the significance of the images between the holes, and other technical questions that have come up regarding the Zapruder film? Finally, in this area, there's a question whether possible future technology not known today using the original film may be able to answer questions that cannot be answered through current technology. Questions that would seem to be also appropriate if, for the question of whether there is the statutory authority to take the film, are as follows. What actions may the review board legally and properly take in order to ensure that the public has access to the original and to high-quality copies of the film? If the board believes that the film should be owned by the U.S. government, should the taking be by an action of the review board, or is that an action that should be taken by Congress? Another question is whether the review board, under the JFK Act, has the legal authority to take the Zapruder film. Another question is, what are the possible consequences of the board's attempting to take the original film? What are the possible consequences of the board's not attempting to take the original film? Another question which may be of interest to the board is what monetary value should be attached to the film. Now, I should say to the public here that the board has received in confidence monetary appraisals of the Zapruder film that were conducted by experts retained by the Department of Justice and by LMH Company in cooperation with each other. So the board has had some information which is currently protected on some valuations, and which the board is free to either accept or reject in its best judgment. To say that the Zapruder film is invaluable or is important does not really answer the question of what monetary value should be attached to the film. If the film were taken by the JFK Act, or if Congress were to purchase the film, the legal owner would still need to be compensated. How much should the government pay to compensate the original owner? Finally, is there a cost beyond which the government should not take the original? Should it be up to a certain amount, it would be appropriate for either the review board or the Congress to take the film, but beyond that amount, it would not be appropriate. Those are all questions confronting the board. And finally, a question that the board should consider is whether the board, if it decides not to take action to take the Zapruder film, should it urge Congress to take the film? Thank you very much.
Any questions or comments from Mr. Gunn while we have him up here?
My favorite kind of question.
Thank you. As usual, you've raised a lot of questions for us to ponder today. Next, we'd like to hear from Robert Brownice, who is Associate Professor at the George Washington University Law School and an expert on the takings issue. Welcome, Professor Brownice.
Thank you, Mr. Sondheim.
And thank you for joining us today.
As I understand it, the review board is interested, in my opinions, about a number of issues related to the exercise of the government's eminent domain power, its power to force private individuals to give up property, over this camera original film taken by Mr. Zapruder, especially the issue whether the Records Collection Act affects a taking of the film for which just compensation is due, or whether it authorizes the review board to effect such a taking. And I'm going to direct my prepared comments to that narrow issue, the issue of legal authorization, and then any other broader issues that can be explored later in questions. Let me say at the beginning that there's really not any constitutional question here. Under settled law, Congress has eminent domain powers over both real estate and personal property in the United States, presumably including the Zapruder film. Nor do I think that there's any question that if the review board were to direct the archives to place the film in the JFK collection, that would constitute a taking for which just compensation is due. The issue, rather, is a statutory one, and that is, given that Congress had the power to exercise eminent domain, did it do so? Or did it authorize the board to do so in the Records Collection Act? And having closely examined the text of the statute and the legislative history of the statute, my conclusion is that this is a close call. There are arguments to be made on both sides. And therefore, I think it would be most helpful for me today to outline the arguments on either side and then leave the difficult questions to you. Let me first consider the portions of the text and the legislative history that weigh in favor of the exercise of eminent domain or of the taking of the film. Mr. Gunn has already covered some of this material in his testimony. There are two major operative provisions in the Act. They are sections 5C1 and 5D3. They both use the terms assassination record and possession. Section 5C1 directs each government office to review, identify, and organize each assassination record in its custody or possession for eventual transmission to the JFK collection. Section 5D3 directs the archives to place in the JFK collection all, again, assassination records which are in its possession and which have been publicly available in their entirety without redaction. Mr. Gunn has suggested that it's not really a question before the board today whether the Zapruder film constitutes an assassination record, but I guess just to add to that, I think I'd point out that if a court were in the position of having to decide this issue, I think that there is a very good chance that it would find that the Zapruder film is indeed an assassination record. So, putting aside for the moment other provisions of the JFK Act, these two operative provisions would indeed seem to mandate the transmission of the Zapruder film to the JFK collection. If the issue of whether it's an assassination record is put to one side, the only other issue is was it in the custody or possession of either the archives or some other government agency? And I think there's a pretty good argument to be made that it was. So that's the major part of the text of the statute which weighs in favor of the finding that the statute has taken the film. The other major factor, it seems to me, that weighs in favor of a taking is the text of the Act, and particularly all of the statements in the legislative history of the Act that disclose the purpose of the Act. The Senate report on the Act notes that in the eyes of the public, each investigation and inquiry into the assassination of President Kennedy served to raise additional questions about the assassination. The Senate report states that the JFK Act was a result of the recognition by Congress and the executive branch that the records related to the assassination of President Kennedy be fully disclosed. The Zapruder film, as has Mr. Gunn's already stated, is such an important record of the assassination that it may well be the case that failure to maintain a government possession of the camera original or to disclose it to the public might well undermine the public confidence, and there I'm quoting again from the Senate report, that it identifies as one of the underlying principles of the Act. So there's the gist of the case in favor of a taking. Let me turn to the other side. now, however, and look at the text and the legislative history and an interpretive principle that courts might apply that weigh in the opposite direction. It seems to me, having looked at the Act, that the most important piece of text may be Section 11A of the Act. Section 11A creates an exception to those operative provisions I was talking about earlier. It creates an exception to this Act's requirement that all assassination records in the possession of government agencies be transmitted to the JFK collection and publicly disclosed. Section 11A in particular says that the Act's requirement will not apply when it conflicts with, and here I quote the Act, deeds governing access to or transfer or release of gifts and donations of records to the United States government. So in other words, someone has given records to the federal government, and they've placed certain restrictions on them as to transfer of those records or release of those records. The review board is directed by the Act to respect those restrictions. One could interpret this exception as a result of a determination by Congress that when private individuals have retained certain rights in records that are in possession of the government, the Act shouldn't be applied in such a way as to violate or diminish those rights. Now, my understanding is that the Zapruder film was delivered to the archives under a storage agreement that gives its owners the right to retrieve it from the archives. This storage agreement is not a deed in the narrow sense of deed within Section 11A, which gives rise to sort of another ambiguity that the board would have to deal with. Although it's not a deed in the narrow sense of that term, it is an agreement which grants limited rights to the archives and which reserves rights in a private grantor. Indeed, one might say it reserves greater rights in the private grantor than a restricted deed would. The JFK Act also grants the review board the power to issue regulations interpreting the terms of the Act, and I think it's likely that a court would uphold a broad interpretation of deed as covering any instrument under which possession of or title to a record was transferred to a government office. So I think if the review board were to come to the conclusion that it thought it appropriate to define deed broadly, that a court would probably uphold that broad definition. That, of course, would mean then that the review board would not be mandated by the Act to transfer the Zapruder film to the JFK collection. And significantly, the Senate report on the JFK Act, the Records Collection Act, states that if the review board locates assassination records that were given to the government subject to restrictions, it should, and here I quote the Senate report, where possible, seek the waiver or necessary permission to open the records to the American public. This language doesn't seem to contemplate a taking in which the review board would force public disclosure and pay just compensation to the donors for breaking their restrictions. Rather, it seems only to contemplate that the board would seek a voluntary waiver of the restrictions on the part of those donors. Now, aside from Section 11A, the Act also contains several references to government records, a term that shows up in a number of provisions in the Act, which could be read as suggesting that the Act applies only to records owned by the government. The term government records applies in the findings and declarations portion of the Act, and it also appears in a number of its operative provisions. And perhaps most significantly, Section 4A1 of the Act provides that the JFK collection at the National Archives, quote, shall consist of record copies of all government records relating to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Government records, however, is an undefined term in the Act, and Section 4A2, the immediately subsequent section describing in detail the contents of the JFK collection, says that that collection will include all assassination records that the Act requires it to include. Now, the term assassination record, of course, is defined, and I think it does not appear to require government ownership. And my guess here is just that the term government record is a remnant of an earlier stage of the process of drafting the Act, probably should have been wholly replaced by assassination record. And one of the ways one might render various portions of the Act consistent would be to interpret government record as meaning any record in the possession of the government, not where title is owned by the government. In addition to these two items of text that the JFK Act does contain, it might be notable that the Act is missing any reference to eminent domain or just compensation. And in this respect, one might contrast the Act with the so-called Presidential Recordings and Materials Preservation Act, the famous act concerning the presidential papers and the tapes made by President Richard Nixon. This act, the PRMPA, in its acronym form, it's similar in some respects to the JFK Act. It also requires any federal government employee in possession of certain records, here relating to the Nixon presidency, to deliver them to the archivist of the United States, who's directed to retain those records. But the PRMPA expressly recognizes that the actions that it mandates may amount to a taking for which just compensation is required. There's a section in the PRMPA which says payment of just compensation shall be made from the general fund of the United States Treasury if a court holds that any provision of the Act has deprived an individual of private property without just compensation. So in the case of the PRMPA, closely similar operative provisions, but a clear indication from Congress that it realized a taking might be found. By contrast, the JFK Act, of course, contains no provision suggesting that Congress contemplated that the Act might affect the taking. The legislative history of the Act reinforces the impression that Congress didn't contemplate that the Act might require the payment of just compensation. For example, the Senate report on the Act contains a section evaluating the regulatory impact of the legislation. That section declares that the Act, I quote, would not result in any additional regulation to any individuals and businesses, unquote, and therefore would have no economic impact on any individuals or businesses. The Senate report also contains an analysis undertaken by the Congressional Budget Office of the cost of implementing the Act, and that cost estimate does not include any amount for paying awards of just compensation to individuals whose private property is taken by the Act. And then finally, having taken a look at the text of the statute and the legislative history, let me just point out one interpretive presumption that courts use that may also weigh in favor of a finding that the Act does not affect the taking. The Supreme Court has stated that the power of eminent domain, the power to force private individuals to give up their property, quote, must be given in express terms or by necessary implication. So it's a kind of rule that says if you want to use the power of eminent domain, you have to do it clearly. It's possible to argue that if the JFK Act indeed mandates transfer of all assassination records in government hands to the JFK collection, and the Zapruder film is an assassination record, then we could say it is a necessary implication that eminent domain power will be exercised in making the transfer if it turns out that the Zapruder film is private property. The canon, however, or interpretive presumption, indicates that a court, if faced with equally balanced conflicting evidence about whether a statute directs actions that might or might not amount to a taking, would likely decide that the statute did not require such actions. So in sum, there's support on both sides of this takings issue, and I would, for one, would find it difficult to predict exactly what a court would do. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Professor Brownice. Questions, members of the board?
Yeah, I have a question.
Go ahead.
It's been of great interest, this question of possession. And it may very well be, for example, that the Congress was not as aware of the fact that the archive stores things, and so uses the word possession. Possession, in your view, then, means what? Does it mean that the Zapruder film may or may not, because you just finished saying that if it turns out that the Zapruder film is not in the hands of the government, is it your opinion then that the film is or is not
in the possession,
of the federal government?
Of the federal government? I think it's most likely that a court would find that the film is in the possession of the federal government. It's not entirely the case that Congress was completely unaware. I think that the archive stores items, although the material in the legislative history is sort of scant, but the archivist did mention the deposit agreements in the legislative history. So some evidence that Congress may have been aware of that.
Can you point to precedents, Professor Brownice, where the United States government has taken artifacts, so to speak, from private individuals using its eminent domain power?
Well, I think the most famous recent example is the act under which the Nixon tapes and papers were taken from President Nixon and retained by the government. The District of Columbia Circuit, the federal court, decided that indeed that act did constitute a taking and ordered that the government pay just compensation for those records. And those were tapes and papers and all sorts of things that pertain to the Nixon administration. So that's a very clear example recently of the taking of certainly a larger bulk of records than is involved here.
Go ahead.
Mr. Brownice, let me ask you, would this case, or this set of circumstances, be different if in fact the film were not in the archives?
Oh, I think it would. I guess that relates in part back to Ms. Nelson's question about possession. If the film were not in the archives, then there's much greater issue about whether any of the operative provisions in the Act mandate the transmission of the film to the JFK collection. It's not in the possession of any government agency. And I think it most likely, under those circumstances, that the Act would not mandate transmission of the film.
So the distinction with regard to possession turns out, at least for purposes of thinking our way through the statutory understanding, turns out to be significant.
That's correct.
Okay. Is there anything in the legislative history that would suggest to you that those who framed the statute intended that the Zapruder film be exempted from being included as an assassination record? And I pose that question in the context of, at least in one instance, that with regard to the autopsy photographs,
right,
they were fully capable of designating a specific category.
Yeah, there's nothing in the legislative history that specifically singles out the Zapruder film. There's no mention of the film by name that suggests that Congress was thinking of exempting it from the collection. The only indication in the legislative history is testimony of the Archivist of the United States, which may have resulted in the amendment, the placement of Section 11A in the Act, the broader exception that I was talking about earlier. That exception for restrictions in gift deeds was not in the original drafts of the Act, and the archivist testified that failure to put such an exception in the Act would likely result in fewer donations of records, and therefore there should be such an exception. And one of the archive's position statements actually mentions deposit agreements as well as gift deeds. But as we know it, Section 11A only refers to gift deeds.
Well, let me, if I may, Mr. Chairman, press just a little bit on this particular issue and raise with you the question of whether or not Section 11A is directed at the question of how materials that are in the possession of can be used, and access granted and rights to be able to view them would be structured between the archives and a person who's making a donation or a contribution, as against the question of removal of the material altogether from the possession of the government and returning it to the individual who originally donated it.
It's possible that that Congress did have in mind that sort of distinction. Section 11A mentions transfer as well as disclosure, so they may have been concerned about physically where the items were, but it certainly is the case that if the item was indeed donated to the federal government, then one would presume that it remains in the possession of the federal government, and as you say, the issue is simply where is it in the government's possession, when will it be disclosed, and to whom under what conditions?
I have one final question, if I may, and that is, if I could, and I'm not sure this is appropriate, and that's really where I need your help, the law professor's help here. What if we took our understanding of this issue and did not see it initially as a question of taking or eminent domain, although that matter may well enter into the discussion at some other point, but viewed it rather as a question of bailment? That is, the Zapruders had given the film to the archives are acting in the capacity of a bailee in the set of circumstances that were governed by then existing rules. The rules, however, in the course of the time that the material was held, the bailment arrangement had changed. Would it not be possible then that the archives would find itself in some conflict, and that it might, and the government might well, in that capacity of acting as a bailee, act in favor of retaining the material, given the fact that it is not private in the strict sense of the word, but rather is in fact in possession and has now become an assassination record, and therefore the archives could do what it did, which is to say we're not going to return the material because we cannot do that in our capacity, acting in this bailment capacity.
I think, in fact, that's the other side of Section 11A. Section 11A is titled Rules of Construction, and it says that the mandates in the other operative provisions of the Act shall supersede any other statute and any other common law doctrine, and that's the doctrine of bailment, that might direct a government agency to do something different. And the only exception that it makes is for gift deeds that have certain restrictions in them. So if Section 11A on the one hand opens up this possibility of gift deed, on the other hand it sort of forecloses other possibilities and says common law doctrines shall not take precedence over this Act.
Okay, thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman, if I might ask Professor Brown-Eyes to come back to the point that Judge Thunheim was on before, about whether there's a precedent for the handling of something like this. Was this film transmuted into an assassination record, and therefore did it become like a document in the Nixon case, or is there something unique about this, like the Liberty Bell or Betsy Ross's flag or what, that requires a special kind of legal treatment?
I don't think that the Act certainly has anything to say about its Liberty Bell status as affecting its legal status. The Act, of course, defines assassination record very broadly to include not only paper, but films, sound recordings, and so on. And the Zapruder film may not be the only record within that definition that has gained some sort of iconic status over the years. So I don't really see.
But we have not identified another with this kind of iconic status.
Right. I suppose my answer remains the same, though. I don't really see that that particular aspect changes things legally.
Professor Brownites, is there any support for the proposition that the legislation in designating assassination records as including all exhibits before the Warren Commission, and since the Zapruder film was shown to the Warren Commission, is there any support for the proposition that it is already an assassination record by the passage of the Act?
Oh, I think that's quite possible. Yeah. Of course, the Act also grants the power to the board to define the terms of the Act, and you have taken that power and defined the assassination record. There may well be outer limits to that power, though, and if you were to attempt to use your power to define assassination records so narrowly that it excluded the Zapruder film or excluded other records that came before the before the Warren Commission, that a court might find that you had exceeded the scope of your delegated powers under the Act, that when it gave you some leeway to define terms, it didn't give you leeway to say that a horse was a cow.
So just to clarify that issue a little bit more, is it possible to argue that the Act has already effectuated a taking of this particular artifact and therefore there is essentially no decision before the board?
I think it is. That's right. I think it is. I think it is.
And to go back again, there is a distinction to be drawn here between a film of the assassination that reposes, or is in repose in the refrigerator of the archives, and a film that's held in someone's desk in Dubuque.
I think that's a very important distinction.
Of course, the Zapruder, the LMH company has been, of course, challenged this view, in which case it would then be taken to the Court of Claims.
That's correct.
Presumably. It seems to me that, well, it's an interesting thought that the Act has already decided this issue for us. Is that really what you meant? I mean, we keep pushing that because that, of course, is a very interesting new idea that you brought in today.
That is really what I meant, yeah. Again, as I suggest, although the Act gives the power to the review board to issue interpretive regulations, a court might find that there are limits to that power.
Yes, of course.
And if the film is an assassination record that was in the possession of certain government agencies, then the Act just says it shall be transmitted to the JFK collection.
And it was a part of the Warren Commission.
That's correct.
I'm going to ask you one last question, Professor Brownice. You've examined a lot of cases in which takings have occurred and in which courts have determined value eventually for the material that was taken. Any thoughts you have for us on what the financial cost to the taxpayers might be in a case like this one?
Well, the measure of damages, or the measure of just compensation generally, is fair market value.
Does that include commercial value? That
certainly does. It's what the property would bring on the open market if it were, say, put up for an auction. That's the measure of damages. I certainly can't speculate as to what that would be. There are other appraisal experts, I'm sure, who would have their say about that. I suppose the only one other thing I might mention is that there could be a separate value and perhaps Mr. Gunn has already adverted to this, could be a separate value placed on the physical object itself, the camera original film, and other rights associated with that film, such as copyright. And so you might easily place one component of fair market value is the fair market value of the original as an artifact. The other component is other rights, such as copyright.
Just one quick question in pursuance of that. Is there precedent for a taking to transfer a title but to leave copyrights and other rights similar to that with the original owner?
I have not come across a case in which that's been done, but I would not find it all out of the ordinary given the structure of copyright law, which presumes that copyright is completely separate set of rules than the rules about title over the physical object.
Thank you very much, Professor Brown. I
Thank you, Justice
appreciate
Chairman.
your joining us today. Very good. Next, we're going to hear from Jim Lazar, who is the president of the Assassination Archives and Research Center. Welcome, Mr. Lazar.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. Whoops. Members of the panel.
We're happy to have you back again to advise
Thank you.
us today.
It's a pleasure to be here. The questions that the board has asked are revolving around eminent domain are not really within my expertise, so I face them with some trepidation, particularly after listening to Professor Brownice's very scholarly exposition, pointing up all of the aspects of the statutory language that bear on the questions. I have a somewhat different take on a couple of matters that may have some bearing on the ultimate issues. First, I think that while it's important always to analyze the bits and pieces of a statute, that those bits and pieces have to be considered in light of the overarching purpose of the statute. And the JFK Act was clearly intended to accomplish a couple of things that are set forth in Section 2 of the Act, findings, declarations, and purposes. And the very first finding, declaration, and purpose is that Congress found that all government records related to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy should be preserved for historical and governmental purposes. I think it's very important that the board take actions consistent with that purpose and not lose sight of the forest here. I also have a thought regarding whether or not the JFK Act has already effected a taking. And it's my view that with respect to the copyright in the film, that the JFK Act has in fact effected a taking by virtue of the very section that the professor has cited, Section 11A, which provides that the JFK Act in effect overrides all prior statutes. The JFK Act having been passed subsequent to the Copyright Act, I think that it overrides the Copyright Act, and so the Congress has itself effected a taking of the copyright. Now, that has implications certainly for the value of the film, because the value of the commercial value of the film is hardly separable from the copyright in the film. And it also has implications in terms of public access, because under both the JFK and the Freedom of Information Act, if it is an assassination record, and I think unquestionably it is, then the public has a right to have copies of the film, certainly at no more than cost, and under the waiver provisions of both acts, the public may also, in certain instances, be able to get them without cost. So that leaves you with the question of the value of the actual physical copy, the camera original, as divorced from the copyright. And it seems to me, one, that value is greatly diminished. It certainly is important to have it in the collection for various reasons. The JFK Act, Section 4 of the JFK Act, also provides that the archivist, in establishing the collection, is to ensure the physical integrity and provenance of all records. I think it is difficult, if not impossible, to ensure the integrity of the film and its provenance so long as it remains subject to the whim and caprice of private ownership. So I would argue that, and it seems to me also somewhat ludicrous to argue that Congress did not intend the most important and a unique piece of evidence to be in the collection, to be fully accessible to the public. And I think it needs to be subject to government ownership in order to not only to preserve it, but to make sure that with advances in technology, the public may have access to the information provided by any advances in technology that can take place. So now, as to one other, there are various scenarios as to how this matter could resolve itself. I have suggested that, in fact, the Act has already effectuated the taking, and the implication of that is that someone who wanted to put that to the test can file suit under the Freedom of Information and JFK Acts and seek a court resolution of it. There have been previous attempts to ensure that the Zapruder film be made part of the public dialogue on the Kennedy assassination. And that history is first in the Barnard Geis Associates case, which I think Professor Tink Thompson will, Josiah Thompson will inform you about later. The court ruled that it was that the copies that he made of it for use in his book 6 Seconds in Dallas were subject to the fair use doctrine. Secondly, Professor Melville Nimmer, a noted copyright scholar and First Amendment scholar, proposed that in a very certain narrow class of cases, the First Amendment interest in enlightened democratic dialogue overrides the copyright interest. He gave two examples of that. One, the example of the famous photographs of the My Lai massacre. The second, the Zapruder film. And in his opinion, it would be unconscionable that the copyright interest would supersede the overwhelming public interest that could not be fulfilled in any other way but through access to the photographs. I think that if I'm correct, if the JFK Act has effectuated an expropriation of the copyright, then it would seem bizarre to hold that Congress did not also intend that the camera original would not be in the possession of the government. For one thing, it would mean that future requesters would not be able to take advantage of advances in technology to request the newly available information. Those are basically my thoughts. I'll be happy to answer any questions if I can.
Let me ask you a question, Mr. Lazar. You were active in the passage of this act and testified before the Congress, quite active as I recall. Why don't you think the Congress specifically mentioned the eminent domain issue in the act?
I have no idea. I had an input into the act, but not into that part of it. I can only say that when I saw Section 11, my immediate reaction was, that takes care of the Zapruder film.
Mr. Lazar, we all heard Professor Brown Eyes say that, acknowledge that quite likely the Court of Claims would have to hear a case that the LMH company would in fact probably seek money, seek payment. And so part of our task is to perhaps decide how much in fact the American people will be out, taxpayers will be out, if we in fact decide to take the film under any of these conditions, and say it is part of the act anyway. How far up would you, as someone who has had the assassination resources, so many of those documents, how high should we go? That is to say, it's difficult to compare, but we know, for example, that Bill Gates paid about $20 million for the Leonardo Codex. How far should we go? Making an assumption here that it is not already included. I'm making a different kind of assumption.
I don't know. I'm not familiar enough with the calculations that would go into that to make a very, very good guess as to it. More as a personal reaction than as a legal matter. I would think that the fair market value should be offset by the very large sums of monies that have been paid out in the past. And I must say that what particularly troubles me about the exercise, which I view as a misuse of the copyright with respect to this film over the past decades, is that it has, I think, thwarted the intent of the copyright provision in the Constitution, which I view as ordinarily intended to be consistent with the First Amendment. For 12 years after the assassination, the American public did not get to see this film, and that had a devastating impact on the history of the case, delaying its reinvestigation, among other things, by more than a decade. So I would hope that there be some recognition that the copyright holder has already garnered an enormous windfall profit from this film and would not put the taxpayers to any further great expenditure of funds.
What would your estimation be of the amounts that the Zapruders have earned from the copyright?
Well, I would say that it probably would approach $1 million, is my guess. We start with 150,000 that we know about for certain. There have been movie producers that have paid reportedly $30,000 or $40,000. There have been television producers and others. So I would not be surprised if it approached that figure, but I have no personal knowledge of it. I think that is something that the review board should try and find out if it has to make a determination as to how much should be paid for the film.
Let me, if I may, kind of follow up on that and follow in the context of Anna's question. Would it be your judgment that, and let's assume for purposes of argument that the copyright issue is not settled in the way that you believe it should be, is there any ceiling on what the American people should pay?
Oh, I think there's obviously a ceiling. There's a ceiling to everything short of national survival. But where that ceiling is, I don't know.
Well, certainly one of the important, that is an interesting and important issue here, and so is the question of what researchers and scholars might take from the Zapruder film, either in matters of research or matters of authenticities, given the controversy that surrounds the film. Mm-hmm. Can you speculate for us at all about what it might mean to a researcher to have this original available?
Oh, I think it means a great deal to the research community. I mean, remember that I cited some of the findings of the purpose of this act, but perhaps the overriding purpose of the act was to restore some confidence in government. It's very difficult for me to see how you can go to the assassination community and say we have restored confidence in the ability of the government to come to grips with this history, and yet we are leaving the single most important piece of evidence in the hands of a private citizen. That seems to me just to be self-defeating. It can't be done.
But the crux of that understanding would be that a high-quality copy or a copy made of the Zapruder film before it got into trouble at Time Life would not be as good as the original.
Well, it's not only the question of the quality of the original, it's what happened to the original splicings that took place. There's a history to the original that is important. And let me just allude to one other thing. The Act says it is not only, it refers to preserving it for historical and governmental purposes. Now, of course, the odd thing about this film is that it was not seized by the government at the start. This is a criminal case, in fact, the criminal case of the highest magnitude, and evidence is routinely seized in criminal cases, and that was not done here.
But if I remember my legal precedents well, the rule with regard to seizure and maintenance of evidence is a function of fact of having a criminal proceeding.
Well, that and the fact that there wasn't is a consequence of Oswald having been shot. But there is still the possibility, remote though it may be, that at some point there will be a criminal proceeding, and then this provision that preserves it for governmental purposes takes precedence. It's inconceivable to me that at that point the government would not assert its interest in the original. I mean, the court rules require originals, record copies. And there is also a provision in the Act that refers to record copies, the obligation to preserve record copies. The Zapruder film, the Kamna original, is the ultimate record copy in this case.
But if 20 years or 25 years from now there's nothing there, would anyone have any interest in the Zapruder film if in fact the images that are there now?
If it completely deteriorates into an amorphous mass, I suppose the answer is no.
Right. So it could look like a bad deal to pay out a lot of money to lay claim to something that will not exist in the future.
That's certainly a consideration. Yeah.
Thank you.
Joyce had a question here, too.
I'd like to follow a related path. You mentioned in the course of your statement that you thought it was important to preserve the film against the development of future technological advances that could assist us understanding the event. And I'm wondering if you could, given your knowledge of the concerns and the issues that are in the research community, if you could tell us what kinds of information or what questions are currently focused on the film as a piece of evidence concerning the assassination, and how future developments might assist researchers understand the event.
Well, as to the technological aspects, it's beyond my ken. I'm not a photographer, and I'm not very well versed in computer science. So I do not know what the potentials are with respect to computer enhancement and other matters. I would suggest that you might solicit the views of experts in those fields.
My question really was aimed at the questions the researchers would like to have answers to.
One obvious thing which was alluded to by Mr. Gunn in his presentation is the material between the sprocket holes. And about 20% of the exposed surface of the original film falls between the sprocket holes. It is not reproduced on the film copies of the original. However, it can be reproduced through slides. So it requires the original in order to capture that information. And that, I think, is certainly a priority in the research community, is having a high-quality copy made of the camera original that will reproduce the material between the sprocket holes. So that's one. Now, there are other issues which I'm less familiar with, but I hear rumblings of them in the hinterlands about questions about authenticity of the film and alterations of the film and so forth. I'm not really qualified to speak about those.
One final question, Mr. Lazar. Your point that you made earlier that any award of financial costs for taking of this film should be offset by the costs that the family has made off the film, and I understand that completely from a visceral kind of reaction. Are you aware of any cases that would establish that principle that we can look at?
No, I'm not. However, I haven't had any chance to research the issue, but I'm not aware of any. Returning to Professor Joyce's question, some of the other the questions are the obvious ones that relate to the sequence and timing of shots, the direction of shots, where the wounds are located, the movements of witnesses, the movements and reactions of Secret Service personnel, Dallas Police Department personnel. All those things are of interest to the research community.
Thank you, Mr. Lazar. We appreciate your testimony today.
Thank you very much.
Next, we're going to hear from Mr. Josiah Thompson, who is an author, one of the early authors of a widely read book on the assassination, 6 Seconds in Dallas, I believe. Mr. Thompson, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Marwell, distinguished members of the panel. I do not have a prepared statement, but sitting here, I've had a few thoughts on two basic points. One concerns the anomalies concerning this film in private hands, which I had much experience of in the 1960s and 70s. And secondly, a question that was just asked. What is the central, enormous research importance of this film? I could, and I will, give you some reasons for seeing the centrality of the film. Friday afternoon, November 22nd, and Forrest Sorrells is in Abraham Zapruder's office. Abraham Zapruder gets his camera out of the safe. Had Forrest Sorrells said, Mr. Zapruder, I'm taking that camera and that film as evidence in this homicide, we might still be here today, but we wouldn't be here with this particular problem. Forrest Sorrells did not do that. I think he made a mistake. And because he did not do that, in August of 1966, when I came to this very building and saw the Zapruder film for the first time, what I was permitted to see was a copy of a Secret Service copy. In the summer of 1966, that was the only way any ordinary citizen in this country could see a copy of the Zapruder film, was coming to the archives, registering, and have Marion Johnson screen a copy of a copy for you. I did that. It was a miserable copy, a miserable copy. I had heard through the grapevine that Life's original and Life's copies made from that original, 4x5 transparencies, were remarkably clear. Through brute luck, 2 months later, I ended up being hired to co-direct Life magazine's assassination investigation and was permitted to see copies made from the original, 4x5 transparencies made from the original. Everything I'd been told was correct. They were remarkably clear. One could see the hit on Connolly, which was completely unclear on the copy in the archives. Dallas, November 1966. We have 4x5 transparencies. The Life team is made up of 3 or 4 members. One of those members ends up either stealing or destroying 4 of those frames, very, very important frames. As a young professor of philosophy, I had not a clue what was going on, but I knew something was going on. So 3 weeks later, I snuck a camera into the Time Life building and made a copy of the Zapruder film against specific orders of my employer, Life magazine. Did that for 2 reasons. The film was in private hands, in private custody. I figured I had no idea what was going on at Life magazine, figured it was a power struggle of some sort, and thought for posterity, for all of us, it would be very useful to have a copy outside those private hands. In addition, I wanted to make certain measurements on the film concerning the movement of the president's head, measurements that were finally published in 6 seconds, which would give some notion as to whether impressed forces on the president at the time of the headshot could be interpreted as either 1 shot or 2 shots. I was not permitted to take the film out of the building, hence to do that I had to make a copy. I had to steal a copy. The following June, we made an offer to Time Inc. My publisher and I made an offer which was we would turn over all commercial interest in the book to Time Inc. in exchange for the right to use selected parts of certain Zapruder frames. We were turned down flat and on advice of counsel went forward and published artist renderings of those films. We were sued. I lost all the earnings for the book, but we won. Judge Inzer B. Wyatt of the Southern District ruled in a summary judgment that we had used the film as a fair use. That particular judgment mentioned by Jim Lazar was in fact an enormously important expansion of the doctrine of fair use where First Amendment privilege is involved. That's the way things stood. In other words, what I'm trying to explain here is that with the film in private hands, all sorts of anomalies occurred. The necessity of me trying to act for the public good to steal a copy of the film, which is a rather extraordinary event. Why is this film important? It's enormously important. If you want to know what happened in Dealey Plaza, this film shows you as much as any film can. How could it be used by the research community? Well, there have been certain quibbles about the authenticity of this film. I have no doubt that it's authentic, but that can be proven. That can be shown. All queries and challenges to the authenticity, if this film is in government hands, remains in government hands, can be satisfactorily overcome. When that's done, this film then becomes a baseline for all additional studies of what happened in Dealey Plaza. For example, the medical evidence. There have been many claims of extra autopsies, faking of autopsy photos, etc., etc. If the medical evidence does not match what you see on the Zapruder film, then you might have cause to challenge that sort of evidence. Evidence of other films could be compared against this film as a baseline. If they match, fine. If they don't match, you know that something's wrong. Much more importantly, of course, is the deduction of trajectories and ultimately firing points, which can only be done with great precision by using the most resolved copy of the film available. All of that can be done only if this film remains in government hands. In 1964, J. Edgar Hoover said this case would be forever open. In 1977-78, the House committee judged that a conspiracy was involved in the Kennedy assassination. Was in fact probable. We now know that the case really is still open at this time, and as Jim Lazar pointed out, there may be a federal prosecution in the future. For all those reasons, this central evidence in the case should remain in government hands as it is now. And the legal arguments, I think, that Mr. Lazar and the professor offered should sustain you in your judgment to take the film.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Are there questions of the board? I have a question for you. In terms of the future needs and uses of this film by researchers, do you think that copies made now, particularly copies that might be the complete frame, including the sprocket, copies that are digitalized, do you think that serves the same purpose for the sake of researchers who are examining this film, assuming that you can guarantee that they do come from the original?
Yes, I don't think any researchers should be fiddling around with the original. I think there should be a protocol established as for how a digitized copy is made with the state-of-the-art equipment, state-of-the-art techniques, state-of-the-art algorithms, etc. That digitized copy, which is then fully authenticated, should then be the basis of all research in the future. The original would simply be held as a kind of reference mark that would continually be available to justify the copy as a foundational copy.
Go ahead.
Yes, you seem to water it down a little bit in your last statement. I realize that you don't have a piece of paper in front of you. The importance of holding on to the original. Suppose you had a team saying this is an accurate, true copy of the original. Why would the possession of the original then by the government be essential?
Well, because we don't know whether the techniques that we use tomorrow and the protocols and algorithms we would use tomorrow to make the most highly resolved copy we can make, we don't know that 5 years from now we can't do better, or 10 years from now do better.
Thank you.
And with respect to the question that Dr. Hall asked Mr. Lazar, is there a ceiling on the amount that the taxpayer should pay for this film, in your view?
I don't think the taxpayer should pay a penny for this film. I should add that the figure $150,000, which the Zapruder family received from Life magazine, I know from working at Life, did not include the licensing rights. Life then sold the Zapruder film to Der Stern, to Perry Match, etc., etc. The Zapruder family also had an interest in those licensing rights. So I have no idea whether Jim Lazar's estimate as under $1 million is accurate. In my opinion, it could run as far as $3 to $5 million at this point.
Thank you very much, Mr. Thompson. We appreciate your joining us today. Next, we're going to hear from Moses Weitzman, who is a photographic expert who has worked with the Zapruder film in the past. Good afternoon, Mr. Weitzman.
Good afternoon, panel.
Thank you for joining us.
Much of what I was going to say probably has already been voiced by previous witnesses. My understanding of my testimony was to comment on the technical value of keeping the original, and I believe there are several good reasons for keeping the original under archive control. As already mentioned, technology is advancing exponentially. In the future, we will have better capability of duplicating and analyzing the images, both photochemically and digitally. The copies that I made for Time Life was done 30 years ago. Even today's technology is well ahead. There are better lenses, film, and computerized digital scanning. because of the last mentioned item, digital scanning, which would enable someone to accurately record, but also, unfortunately, to manipulate the image. It would be important to keep the original as a benchmark of accuracy to guard against irresponsible manipulations of the image. One of the, I believe it was Mr. Lazar, mentioned something about the information between the sprocket holes. Unfortunately, when I did the work 30 years ago, there was no equipment for duplicating 8mm. We jury-rigged existing hardware. And the way I came to be recommended to do it was by the manufacturer of the equipment, Oxbury Corporation. That imagery could very well be duplicated by properly manufactured components. And if the material were to be retained by the archive, and I would recommend them doing so, it would be well for them to invest in the hardware, which would be nominal when all things are considered, to properly duplicate this material with today's technology, both photochemically and digitally. There are several very fine companies on the West Coast making motion pictures which are reaping multi-millions, which I'm sure would leap at the opportunity to assist the committee in doing a better job of this. And I would welcome any questions. I guess that presentation's it.
Go ahead, Henry. Mr. Weissman, when did you last see the film?
I think I saw it for a second time when I believe it was CBS brought it to me for duplicating. I think it was an anniversary of the assassination, possibly 1975.
So you do not yourself know from observation what the condition of the film is today?
I was here about 6 or 7 months ago. And
here in the archives?
Here at the archive. I don't remember whether I was shown the film or not, but my recollection of it was in 75 that it was in less condition than it was when I first saw it. And with all things that are not made of stone, they will deteriorate with time. But preservation of film is a fine art today, and Eastman Kodak has put out many, many such papers. It's been my personal experience they even reclaimed a piece of footage that the emulsion was peeling away from the substrate. So there is certainly the possibility of maintaining the film. It's approximately 30 some odd years. You could keep film for 100 years if it's properly maintained.
Thank you.
Well, that was really the heart of my question as well, and that is this truly a wasting asset?
Well, everything everything sooner or later deteriorates and disappears. But I would think for our practical purposes, I would think that you could maintain this film at least for another 25 to 50 years, which would probably serve the purpose well, because by then the technology, as I mentioned, which is advancing exponentially, will enable us, no doubt, to record it with permanent accuracy that is not available today. And my original contention is that it should be kept as a benchmark so that in the near future, if someone starts to manipulate the image and put things in there that really aren't supposed to be there, there will be something that says, hey, this is what the original was. There isn't XYZ person out there in the front.
Do you know how many copies there are of the Zapruder film?
Oh, God. Unfortunately, I probably am the grandfather of many of them. The original copy the very first copy I made was a 16mm film, which I showed to Time Life. They were very, very excited about that. They commissioned us to make a 35mm copy. Since there did not exist any proper equipment, the very first copy I made in 35mm was substandard commercially. It was placed incorrectly via the track area of the film, so it could not be used. That was thrown into a box in my office. I was general manager and quality control and vice president of a company. I left the company shortly thereafter and was then recalled by the owners of the company, Technical Animations, to sell off the assets. They closed the company down. And lo and behold, in my office, there was my box with that piece of film, that technically imperfect copy. And to the best of my knowledge, that copy is what a great many copies have been made from. I kept it as a sample of my expertise, not being into the whole underground culture of the Zapruder. Pardon me?
Part of your portfolio.
So to speak, yes. what I could do. Drawing a perfect circle, so to speak. And that's what I periodically would trot it out to show it to people. I presume at some point, because I didn't keep it under lock and key, somebody made surreptitious copies of it and then used it.
Well, it seems to me if you're concerned about baseline issues, that having some sense of the spread breadth of copies that are out there becomes very, very important. Thank you.
Joyce?
For me.
Mr. Weissman, to return to your comment about the importance of preserving the film as a baseline, I'm wondering, are you absolutely confident that you, on the basis of the knowledge that you have both of the original film and the technology in filmmaking and film reproduction today, that you could authenticate the original film in the camera as the original film?
Let me understand the question. Are you asking me whether at the time I did it initially, did I know it was the original film?
No, I'm asking you if we were to if the film were to be taken today, and one of the important considerations does seem to me to be your thought about the baseline, which other people, I think Jim Lazar mentioned that as well. Are you confident that the film can be authenticated as the original camera copy of the film?
Certainly Eastman Kodak could. It was Kodachrome, and there might be, I don't remember precisely, but I believe there were edge markings on the film as to when it was manufactured. And they certainly could make forensic examination of it when the material was laid down. Mm-hmm. As to whether it's a piece that was be photographed originally, yes, you'd look at it, and if the image reads through the base, we know it came from an original camera. As to whether it would be it would be impossible to make a duplicate contact copy reading through the base. Today, someone might have a hardware to make an image reading through the base optically, that is to say, through a lens. But if one were to make a contact copy, immediately you'd see the difference. It would not be proper to also read the wrong way. So there are a lot of ground rules that one could determine: A, it's an original that was photographed in a camera, and B, it wasn't made by a contact copy, and the manufacturer could give you a good indication of when this particular piece of film was manufactured.
Thank you.
But I've been interested in what you were telling us, because we have heard that the film was really no longer viewable, that it had disintegrated, and I think part of the problem was that in the earliest period when Time Life had it, probably didn't have quite the same facilities that the National Archives has. And just to make sure I understand what you're saying, is that really doesn't matter anymore. No matter how bad off the film is, something can be done with it, and revive it, can restore it, basically.
Unless the image is totally destroyed, and I don't know.
No, I don't think so.
I don't know that answer. The process of duplicating it is on a frame-by-frame basis, on equipment, at least the equipment that I had used, an optical printing machine, which looks like a motion picture projector sitting on a lathe bed facing a very precise camera, focusing on the image and photographing it, is it advanced at a frame at a time. Also, one would use what is called a full immersion gate. That is kind of an aquarium that each individual frame is surrounded by a liquid that has the same refractive index as the emulsion, that would remove a good deal of the damage. If it were being scanned rather than being put onto film, but scanned digitally, then that image could be enhanced and repaired, so to speak, as many modern motion pictures are being done. Yes. For commercial re-release. So unless the material is really, really destroyed, it can be brought to near pristine condition.
And that's an important consideration for us.
There is, however, Mr. Weissman, any evidence that some of the frames from the original are missing through handling at some point in time in its past. That, together with the somewhat deteriorated condition that the film is in, is there any argument that first-generation copies may today be better evidence of the original than the original itself?
Well, certainly a copy should be undertaken now with today's technology. it's better than what I had 30 years ago, no question about it. And I think if that were to be done, someone should invest the $10 or $15 or $20,000 that's necessary for the additional hardware to duplicate regular 8mm with a full immersion gate. The missing frames were missing when I got the material, because that was part of what it is. However, if there exists those frames elsewhere, even if they aren't very good, they could be reinserted and enhanced. So you could reconstruct a digital copy that in some ways might be better than the original, but nevertheless the original would still be the benchmark, because one would assume that this is being done by responsible people and being held under responsible circumstances.
Any further? Go ahead. Go ahead.
Help me a little bit here. There are, in fact, copies of the Zapruder film that predate the taking of those frames, or so there is, in fact, a copy that contains those now missing frames in the original, right? Yes. Now, I guess the question that I would pose then, and this is in the area of speculation, et cetera, would it not be the case that that copy would have, for evidentiary purposes, because it is pristine in the sense that it has not been chopped up, greater value?
No, sir, because it's a contact copy, in my understanding. That is to say, it's an 8mm that was made not optically with a lens, but by contact, a sandwich.
Right.
And as a result of that, fine detail was lost.
All right. So the argument then would be that that previous copy, the full copy that is with the frames in it, is of value, but it doesn't, in your judgment, transcend the necessity of having the original as a baseline.
That's correct, sir.
Thank you.
We've heard arguments over time that there is the ability to enhance the original, to make it into a sharper image, make a better film out of it. Is that true? I mean, can you take the film today and enhance it, or are we simply creating new issues where there weren't issues before?
Yes, there is that capability. I'm not an expert in computer technology. I have a passing understanding of it because it's now a technology that is coming to fruition after I retired. However, from the literature that I've read, the answer to that question is yes, you can take an unsharp image and sharpen it. There are algorithms that will determine where the edges meet, so to speak, of a light and a dark area, and create a new image. You can even, well, you've seen it in motion pictures, Jurassic Park and any number of them, where they create and paint full images. So but unfortunately, that very capability would enable someone who is irresponsible to paint in something that doesn't exist. So the necessity of keeping that Joe block or that meter block in archive is very, very important.
So this baseline argument then really turns out to be important, not just in terms of gauging other copies, but taking account of what might be done with the original if it were put in private hands.
Exactly.
To some way to distort and put out copies that would...
sensational exploitation. I mean, needless to say, everyone here has been exposed to that sort of thing.
Twister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Weissman. We appreciate your testimony today.
Bye-bye.
Next, we're going to hear from Richard Trask, who is a photographic expert on the photography of the assassination and has written a book entitled Pictures of the Pain. And we welcome your presence here today, Mr. Trask. It's good to see you again.
Thank you. Well, I have some prepared remarks, which I'm going to cut down a bit for the sake of time. It is both a pleasure and an honor to be before the board again. After I spoke with you back in March 1995, during your hearings to obtain public input on the scope of your work, I was most pleased that you actively included photographic records within your purview. I believe that the diverse assassination research community and the broader community of American historians almost universally applaud your efforts and tenacity to locate and make available any and all records relating directly and indirectly to the assassination of President Kennedy. I also want to tell you how impressed I have been by the professionalism, objectiveness, and commitment of David Marwell and the staff with whom I have come into contact, particularly Tom Semilek, with whom I have spoken and worked on a number of occasions. I've been asked to comment today upon the significance of the Zapruder film of the President Kennedy assassination, particularly with regards to how the film fits into the historical record of the event. Though I'm not a specialist on photographic technology, I spent over 10 years researching the photographic history of the assassination as to the story of the photographers and their experiences, the visual images they created, and how these images have been used and abused by the government, media, and critic. My wife and I self-published a book in 1994 titled Pictures of the Pain, Photography and the Assassination of President Kennedy. Historical photography is typically defined as the use of photographic images to facilitate the study and interpretation of history. Photography has limitations for use as historical evidence, however, and may exhibit only partial truths, biases, and distortions of reality. It can never tell the whole story of an event, and one must cautiously realize its limits. Yet for all the potential shortcomings, photography comes closer than any other record to being a true trace of reality. While eyewitnesses' accounts of events can be accurate, their accuracy is skewed by the emotional impact of the event upon the witness, the location of the witness to the event, personal bias, the later opinions of others, and recollections over time. Through the medium of photography, however, a photographer captures on film in a form truer than any person's eye or memory brief, relevant, and dramatic slices of the reality of the scene. And these created images are able to be examined and interpreted as true historical artifacts of the incident itself. At Dealey Plaza on November 22, 1963, about 36 people had cameras. These incidental observers of history recorded in a variety of photographic formats and with differing equipment and skills the last moments in the life of a president of the United States. One of the most famous photographers there was Abraham Zapruder. Around noontime, Zapruder walked a short distance to the Dealey Plaza Park area. He noticed a rectangular block some 4 feet high at the west end of the decorative concrete pergola area. This location would afford him an elevated perch, giving him a good sweeping view of Elm Street. The complete Elm Street motorcade sequence, which Zapruder filmed, runs about 26 seconds. The 486 frames, all later subsequently assigned individual numbers for investigative references, had been exposed through Zapruder's telephoto camera lens at 18.3 frames per second. The first 132 frames were shot of the lead motorcycle escort, and when Zapruder started his camera again for an approximately 19-second uninterrupted run, his first frame showed the presidential Lincoln already on Elm Street. To call Zapruder's film remarkable is an exaggerated understatement. It is, due to the subject matter and clear angle of view, undoubtedly one of the most important, if not the most historically important movie film ever made. Noted researcher Josiah Thompson correctly described the Zapruder film to you today and in his 1967 book as, quote, the nearest thing to absolute truth about the sequence of the events in Dealey Plaza, end quote. We watch as the president and governor react to shots being made through their bodies, followed by a short sequence in which Mrs. Kennedy leans forward and holds the arm of the president. The next is a terrible scene as the president's head explodes. Like a rag doll, he crumples into his seat while his wife scurries out towards the car trunk. This amateur home movie, almost not made in the first place, soon became one of the most well-known artifacts of the 20th century. Though this strip of film shows us in excruciating detail the fact that a president died, it also opened to immense speculation the interpretation of the exact means of his death. Had the Zapruder film never been taken, Much of the later debate over the actual sequence of shots, the timing of the shots, and the victim's reactions to the shots would not have taken place. It is a dichotomy that much of these later controversies surrounding the facts of the assassination found birth in this, the very piece of evidence that brought us the most truthful visual record of the assassination itself. As a result of the film's existence, various government agencies and a subculture of investigators have delved into science, pseudoscience, studying physics, ballistics, medicine, pathology, human reaction to stimuli, and photo interpretation, all to find the truth of the reality. During the afternoon of November 22nd, Zapruder had his film developed and then had 3 first-generation copies made. Later that day, the Dallas Secret Service was given custody of 2 of the copies of the film. These prints were subsequently used by the FBI and Secret Service in the government's investigation. The existence and potential newsworthiness of this film soon became known to the media. Life magazine editor Richard Stoley arrived in Dallas by the end of the day. Life had the reputation of being the premier weekly illustrated magazine which prided itself in its ability to snag and illustrate important stories. Stoley contacted Zapruder and was able, through good timing, Life's deep money pockets, and the magazine's fine reputation as perceived by Zapruder, to acquire all reproduction rights in the original film. Life published a selection of the film frames in its November 29, 1963 issue. Its emotional impact on the American public was immense. Though additional frames were reproduced in subsequent issues of Life over the next few years, Time Life's dogged refusal to allow this key historical film to be reviewed by the public in any form save by what Life believed to be appropriate was the cause for many legitimate observers to condemn their policy. This possessive and secretive attitude would help foster the belief among many observers that Life was significantly responsible for preventing serious non-governmental investigation from learning the entire truth about the assassination. The Warren Commission relied heavily on in-house studies of what the Zapruder film revealed. The hearings volume, made available in November 1964, included reproductions of over 160 frames from the film. As a result, for the first time, interested researchers had a chance to examine much of the film for themselves. This was followed in 1969 by bootleg copies of the movie, which came into general circulation as the result of the Garrison investigation, and the first television broadcast of the film in March 1975. The film became more and more available, and criticism of Time Life's repressive policy made the company so uncomfortable that in April 1975, the film's ownership was transferred back to the family for $1. Numerous theories and books have been produced as a result of the study of the Zapruder film. Various government agencies, major corporations, and institutions of higher learning have been caught up in the interpretation of this film's meaning, while scores of objective and subjective amateur sleuths have attempted to exact from it elusive truths. And what of the actual significance of this film to the understanding of the events of the assassination? How does it compare with other surviving documentary materials? Comparing it to the 14 other known amateur and professional 8 and 16 millimeter films made in Dealey Plaza during the assassination and the immediate aftermath, it is my considered opinion that the Zapruder camera optics, the film stock used, the film technique of the operator, and clarity of the subject make it far superior to any other films made. It is also the only film to show the assassination in its entirety and from a location which graphically displays the horror of the event and full movements of the victims and others in the presidential limousine. Thus, this is the most important artifact existing which actually displays in visual record the entire assassination, and one of the best, if not the best, in terms of clarity. So too, I would venture to say that given the drama and content of the film, this is undoubtedly the most important film ever made of an historic event. There are certainly other dramatic films which have been made, but none compared to the historic nature of this event. I have been unable to think of another comparable example of such a monumental historic event captured on film so completely. Now, given the importance of the film when compared to other photos and films made that day, how then does this document compare with other singular documentary materials relating to the assassination? As explained earlier, this record is indeed unique and a cornerstone to any examination and investigation into the incident. A simple examination of how this film has been so heavily used in the government investigation and that of so many other investigators easily bears this out. Put simply, this film is, in my opinion, the most important surviving document of the President Kennedy assassination. And what of the significance of the original film versus a good first-generation copy of it? The original Zapruder film is a true artifact in that it was the actual record made during the assassination, the one and the same film exposed at the time of the shooting. A physical examination of it without the necessity of electronics or other interpretive devices save light and enlargement takes us to the time of the event itself and is clearer than any multi-generation copy can be. Though not a technician, I can tell you that an examination of both the original and any copy made from the original, barring any external manipulation, will clearly show the original superior in clarity to any copy. And should the original be within the collection of the National Archives as the representative historical repository of the nation, I believe beyond a doubt that it belongs within the collection owned by the United States. It is my opinion that given the importance of this artifact, both in its historical and potential evidentiary nature, such an artifact should not remain in private or corporate hands and should be in the representative hands of the American people. I am, however, somewhat uncomfortable with the idea of direct taking of private property by the government, even when compensated value given. Perhaps I am too much of an optimist, but I would hope that such an artifact as this, which has generated quite a bit of revenue over the years, might be considered by its current owners to be at a point in its history to be appropriately given over to the American people. It would be preserved and should be available under correct conservation standards for appropriate potential future study. Technologies will undoubtedly continue to evolve, allowing for potentially new study of the far superior original film. Availability of the original film may also lay to rest the present opinion of some buffs that the film was manipulated to get rid of proofs of conspiracy. Possible commercial licensing of the images might possibly be kept by the owners, but the original film artifact itself is too important to be eventually made into a trophy by others for private or personal gain or notoriety. This film was created by a combination of amateur talent and serendipity. Its place in American history is well established, and hopefully the present owners will acknowledge the importance of this film to the American people as a whole by appropriate and generous action. Thank you.
Trask, questions?
I do. Henry? I defer to my colleague.
I have a very simple question. I regret I do not know your book. Have you personally examined the original?
I've never seen the original. I've seen the archive copies and a number of other copies.
How then do you know that there is greater clarity there?
Only because that's a fact of nature. When you are talking about an original photograph as originally taken and compare it with any copy, superiorly made as possible, the copy always, through photographic artifact, through other manipulations, just is not as crisp and clear as an original.
Thank you. I'm sorry.
Let me, if I may, just raise a couple of questions. You used some powerful words in your presentation: truth, reality, and I raise this because I want to put this proposition before you, that the Zapruder film does not show the assassination of the president. The Zapruder film shows the president being shot. It does not demonstrate who shot the president. And indeed, if you compared the Zapruder film with the video that we have of Jack Ruby shooting Lee Oswald on an evidentiary basis, that's a far more powerful piece of film, if you will, than is the Zapruder film. Now, again, I'm playing a little bit of the role of the devil's advocate here, and so you'll have to excuse me, but doesn't that, in essence, really mean that other than the great and tragic circumstance of the president being murdered in the presence of his wife, doesn't that really mean that the Zapruder film, on balance, puts more ambiguity in to our understanding of the assassination than it brings clarity?
Simple answer to that is yes, and I think I was trying to point out that the dichotomy of the Zapruder film is the fact that if the Warren Commission did not have the Zapruder film, much of the controversy that arose as to number of shots, timing, and so forth, just wouldn't have been there, because the other films don't show in the clarity that the Zapruder film does this kind of information.
I think this is an important point. At least it is for Dr. Hall. We would like to operate on the theory that as a piece of evidence, it should be retained because it is conclusory. But I would submit that the value of the Zapruder film lies in its ambiguity. And it is the ambiguity and hence the inability to come to closure with some of the central issues related to the assassination, at least given the present technology, that makes it important as a public record.
There will always be ambiguity with the Zapruder film. However, in my experience of being interested in reading about the assassination over a 30-year period, it's been amazing how much information has been able to be generated by study of the film. I can't tell in the future what new techniques would be devised which will give us a closer aspect of the truth. But no, you're not going to find in the Zapruder film a Rosetta Stone of who did it.
So therefore, how much is it worth to the American public?
Well, as I've kind of said, if it were on the open market, I believe that it would be probably...
But it's a trophy. It's now a trophy. It's not a piece of evidence.
Yes and no. It is evidence. You certainly can find information about it. It's also a matter of the historic record. It's as important to keep something like this as it is anything else in history. It is, I believe, the most dramatic film that was ever photographed showing a presidential assassination.
Thank you.
But to continue that a little bit, LMH clearly has not yet decided, and they've had it a long time, to give it to the American people. So if you were weighing the value, should we weigh the value in a way that would cost what? What is the top?
I believe on the open market something like that would be in the tens of millions of dollars. I do not believe the United States government should pay that kind of money for that type of film.
Thanks.
And I'm hoping, I'm just a little old archivist from a small town in Massachusetts, but I know that people give... In my experience, several years ago, I had a person who made a lot less money than I make, who came in with a copy of the Declaration of Independence that was printed in Salem in 1776. And it had on the back of it to be read before the clergy in Danvers. And I knew when we had it examined, and it was worth in excess of $30,000. And this man did not hesitate, and he could have used the money to give it to our little archives. And I would think that if the Zapruder family, considering the history of this film, what a marvelous demonstration this would be to donate something like this to the American people.
Why don't they have a right to make something off their good fortune?
Well, I think they have. I think it's quite evident that that money has been made off of it from day one.
Thank you very much, Mr. Trask. Appreciate your joining us again. And next, our final witness today is Mr. Art Simon. He is an assistant professor in the Department of English at Montclair State University in New Jersey, and he's the author of the book Dangerous Knowledge, The JFK Assassination in Art and Film, published in 1995. Professor Simon.
Thank you for the opportunity to address the board today. I want to begin by underscoring a theoretical point, one which Mr. Hall has already just discussed. And that is the footage shot by Abraham Zapruder is not a window onto the past. It is not a reproduction. It is a representation. While it is commonplace to say that film offers us a slice of reality, a window onto the world, in fact, what Zapruder did was produce a perspective on the assassination, one that has become the dominant visual point of view of the event. As a product and not a window, Zapruder's choices and his reactions, his decision to film in color, to stand in a certain position, to use 8mm, to move the camera as he did, these give us a mediated form of vision. These do not give us the truth about what took place 33 years ago. I believe there is really limited evidentiary value left in the Zapruder film. Indeed, although I have not looked at the original in its present form, it may be that if first-generation copies exist in good condition, they may be more useful to those who wish to continue the investigation, or, as Mr. Weitzman has suggested, some kind of combination of the original and first-generation copies. Now, I understand that one of the arguments for preserving the original print holds on to the possibility that some future optical technology might be employed that allows the original to yield new important information. As much as I would like to believe this, and with all due respect again to what Mr. Weitzman said, I think this may well be an enabling fiction, a fantasy that motivates further study and fuels a faith that someday historical ambiguities will ultimately be made clear. The film has become a fetishized object, invested with the potential to cover up our lack of reliable answers to many questions. In fact, this faith in future enhancements of the film has been a recurring trope over the last 30 years. And of course, a variety of such processes have been applied to the film. The Zapruder footage has repeatedly been cast in the role of ultimate witness, and investigators on both sides of the debate have insisted that with the proper scrutiny, its images can render a legible view of the event. Now, while 3 decades of analysis has produced a significant challenge to initial readings of the film offered by both the government and the mainstream press, it has also produced a multiplicity of interpretations, a crisis of knowledge, a serious critique of film's capacity to offer a unified vision and discernible truth. In other words, the application of new technologies has not and probably would not guarantee a unanimity of interpretation. What then is the status of the original film? I would suggest to you that it is a secular relic, a material piece of the past, and for reasons that are either psychological or for some perhaps spiritual, individuals and the nation hold on to such relics. I might add parenthetically that we live in a culture which privileges origins, which endows with significance first things, first editions of books, first words spoken by a baby. We have a ceremony for the first pitch of a ball game. We have manufactured that significance through social convention and ritual. In a sense, the government does much the same. Why does the government preserve the original Constitution? We have plenty of copies. We know the contents of the Constitution. Now, while the Constitution was a public document from the beginning, the Zapruder film was not. But still, the nation expends resources to preserve significant objects from the past which have had private origins. People's homes, perhaps Lindbergh's plane, sure the list is very long. Perhaps these objects are maintained for aesthetic reasons, because the textures and faded colors bear traces of time and change. Moreover, perhaps preserving such objects functions symbolically, as the government's way of saying historical consciousness is important, and that although the past cannot be preserved, some index of it can be located in the tangible artifacts which have been kept or rediscovered. The film, then, is part of some ongoing and perpetual archaeology project. Although, on the other hand, we might say that old things are just kind of cool, and we hold on to old things for reasons that we really can't explain. And I'm not sure there's anything wrong with that. And I'm not sure that there's anything wrong with the government acknowledging that we hold on to objects and artifacts for that reason. I would only add to what's been said already, and that is, if federal funds are going to be spent to keep the original film out of private or corporate hands, as I believe it should, then some mechanism for access needs to be maintained. The criticism that's been directed at the government for the last 30-some years over its handling of the investigation of the assassination must be taken seriously. And so I would just propose that the board consider whether or not the government is the right institution to hold on to the film, and consider at least the options of entrusting the film to a museum, a research institution, or a university.
Thank you very much, Mr. Simon. Professor Simon, are there questions?
Actually, Mr. Simon, I don't know that it's it belongs to the Zapruder family, and so obviously it belongs in the National Archives if it is sitting in the archives. Rather than a museum or a private institution, I don't think we could do that under our statute. But of course, your point that it should be kept is an interesting one. But if I understand what you're saying, it's okay to keep secular relics.
Yes.
That it might be useful to keep it for that reason.
For reasons that we might not explain in courts of law so much as raises questions about psychology of the nation, if such a thing exists.
You also, in your book, talk a good bit about its cultural meaning to the society. Is this also something you're intimating when you say that it should be in the public sector because of the failure to put it there for so many years? Is it culturally important?
I don't know from the standpoint of culture for artists who want to borrow the images and recontextualize them to comment on the event, on the last 33 years. I don't know that it's necessary for the government to have the original. Artists can use those images and have used them, exploited them in various ways. So the original film that ran through Zapruder's camera, I don't know that it's necessary for it to have cultural use in the future.
You have quite a turn of phrase. I noted enabling fiction and fetishized object and secular relic among them, all of which speak to a certain kind of, in my view, marginalization of the film in the sense of the film as a record. And I'm wondering that I certainly agree with you that it's important for government to assist us, the population, in terms of our historical consciousness. And I'm wondering if you see, in addition to that, if we don't in fact have a record here, and whether if you have any comment to make about the film in its recordness.
My first comment would be I'm not sure fetishes are marginal. But second, there's no question that it's an important record of the event, and I think those issues have already been addressed. I don't mean to claim that the film has no evidentiary value. It has tremendous evidentiary value. I'm not sure that it has much value left, in the sense that I think that the conflict over interpretation will continue. We've learned important things about what took place on that day thanks to Zapruder's film. So I don't mean to marginalize it as a piece of evidence or a historical record of the event at all, but only to suggest that even though we have the film text that doesn't guarantee in any way that we will all agree about what we see in the text. And so, as Mr. Hall mentioned earlier, ambiguities will persist. Such is the nature of writing history and dealing with evidence from the past.
I can't help reflecting again on that. I think of the Rodney King videotape, and there 3 different juries were able to reach somewhat competing understandings of what that film actually told them. The question, I guess, of some moment in my mind is the extent to which we have an obligation, that is, this generation has an obligation to make sure that generations that come are put in at least as good a position as we are with regard to coming to terms with whatever evidence is there. And one of the problems that I have in this regard is that admitting that there are theories that explain the assassination in terms of the federal government as self-participating, and therefore the last person you'd want to give the emulsion fluid to is in fact the wolf. Recognizing that particular line of argument, it does seem to me that the playing field for those who will subsequently come ought to be in such order that those who come to play with this will be in at least as good a position as we are today, which would seem to indicate to me that there ought to be some response that would make sure that as a physical artifact, and I know you're using the word relic in a different way, but the preservation of that is not just a matter of symbol, but is also therefore a matter of substance.
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree. I would just reiterate that I'm not sure that those future generations will be free of the same kind of interpretive struggle.
Well, yes, we certainly know, if we know anything at all about the writing of history, is that it's hard to find a punctuation mark, and that what we may in fact owe future generations is their opportunity to interpret what they will out of the material. If they do not have the material, it is hard to interpret it.
Yeah, go ahead, Henry.
Professor, I assume you think that rituals and the keeping of artifacts, while I may be fetishistic, some are more fetishistic, all fetishes are equal, but some are more equal than others. And I think that's what we're talking about, and I think that seems to be an element in the response you just gave to Dr. Hall.
You can see we've been reading too many documents.
We've been reading you, too.
Any further questions? Thank you very much.
The question you need to decide then is how much the government pays for a fetish, and what that might be worth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Simon.
Thanks for coming.
Appreciate your testimony, and let me just, on behalf of the board, thank all of our witnesses here today who provided testimony and opinion and thoughts and good advice to us. The review board will be keeping the public record open on this hearing for several weeks until April 18th. So if anyone wishes to address the subject further, we'd be very happy to receive a public comment. It can be sent to the review board's office at 600 East Street, Northwest, Washington, D.C. The zip is 20530. It's the Assassination Records Review Board. I will also note for the record that the board has received thoughtful comments from David Lifton, who is an author who is concerned about this issue as well. And we've also received a letter which will be part of the public record from an attorney for the Zapruder family. Let me again thank the witnesses today for their testimony. I thought it was very helpful and useful for the board as it really debates and considers what the position of the United States should be relative to the camera original version of this historic Zapruder film. The board is going to take a 10-minute recess right now and then return for some brief additional testimony and a relatively brief public meeting as well. We'll be in recess.
What? Well,